So, JoJo Part 2 is pretty much an improvement over Part 1 in literally every way. Like, Joseph, just getting right into it, Joseph is far better than Jonathan as a protagonist. Like, Jonathan was a fine character. I think he was decent in the end, although that was pretty much entirely just because of what was going on around him, not necessarily Jonathan himself, right? But Joseph is just a very interesting character. Like, he's not the deepest in terms of like his development, his past, but he's a very fun character to watch, and he actually like has strategies. Jonathan is pretty much like there's never anything going on with him beyond what you can see right there, right? Like, can't really infer anything about his character. He's just like everything you see is exactly what his character is. There's not much deeper than that. With Joseph, though, there is a bit of that. Like, you see him, and he seems like pretty basic, but then you actually learn he has a lot of strategy and he knows what he's doing really in the fights. Like, first fight of the series is Joseph versus Straight, so it's the first major fight, and it's really well done. Like, the setting keeps changing, they're always walking around. Joseph has like his crazy strategies. It's just super well done. That leads into the fights as well. The fights in part 2 are just so much better than part 1. Like, it is like 10 times an improvement, really. Like, when I'm trying to think of an example here for a specific fight, but they're all just so good. Like, they also use Joseph versus Straight, so again, like, the fight's constantly changing. It's constantly changing of who's in the lead, right? And it changes in an instant. Like, when Joseph attaches those grenades, it looks like he's gonna lose, but then we learn about that, and it just completely changes the course of the fight, and it ends like in a completely different way from when it starts. And you compare that to part 1, like Jonathan versus the zombies. Like, there's some basic strategy there, like when they're underwater and Jonathan gets the air to use him on. But it's like super basic, and that does make sense for the time because fights back then were pretty much just like punching, like just straight punching. Whoever's stronger wins. So it was above. JoJo Part 1 was above the standard, but it still wasn't like anything incredible, right? Part 2 just has way better fights overall, and just the characters in general that are fighting are just so much better. Like, I already talked about Joseph, but Caesar, way more interesting than Will, right? Like, he's got way more personality, he's got an actual past that you learn about, and he doesn't develop as a character. That's kind of the point, right? Like, he dies, and that kind of like motivates. Spoilers, by the way. I don't know why you're watching this if you haven't read part 2, but whatever. Like, the way he motivates Joseph to keep going, and it's another thing I really like about JoJo in general. Like, he's not afraid to actually kill off characters. Like, versus Caesar dies, and it's just, that's throughout the series. Outside of part 3, kind of. Part 3 has some issues with that, but the entire rest of the series handles it really well, right? And then getting into the villains of part 2, this is the only area where I'd say part 1 beats out part 2, and it's not even by that much, right? Like, Cars is just not that interesting of a villain as Dio. Like, Cars, there is a hint of something more interesting going on, like when he saves the dog, right? It seems like he only has a problem with humans. Well, that's not really, like, super interesting, and it doesn't go into it super well. Compare that to Dio, who isn't a deep character at all. He's just so insanely evil that it's a really interesting way to portray the character, right? To where he loops around and becomes interesting again. So yeah, Cars is the only aspect of part 2, I'd say, that is weaker than part 1. I'd also say that the setting of part 2 is far more interesting than the one in part 1, being that you actually explore more areas, and the setting is constantly changing. Like, obviously it starts in New York, then it's in Mexico, then it's in Europe for the rest of the part, right? Like, it keeps changing for pretty much every fight. The setting changes. And that's just really an improvement over part 1, because part 1 was, the setting did change, but it was still in England the entire time, right? And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but you've got to show like more areas than just like a grassy plain. That's why I like the castle segment from the end of part 1 so much. Like, it was actually different, and it provided new challenges instead of the rest of the series, which was just a grassy plain, right? And I think that part 2 does that really well because the setting is constantly changing. It's always interesting, right? And the time period too, the 1930s, because it's not like modern yet, so that provides even more interesting aspects to the series, right? not like part 2 is even that much longer than part 1, really. It's only like, you know, what, like, maybe 1.3 times the length of part 1? I don't know. That obviously, that's not an exact calculation, but it's not that much longer than part 1, yet it has so much more variety in the characters, the setting, uh, pretty much everything is just way more varied and way more interesting than part 1. So that's why I have to say part 2 is an improvement over part 1 in every way. And overall, I wouldn't say it's one of my favorite parts in the series. It it's probably like the 5th place, and with how much praise I've given to part 2, outside of the cars, this has pretty much been an entirely praise-filled video for part 2, right? So that should really just give you an idea of how much I like all the future parts if this is only about 5th place on my ranking out of the current 8 parts. So yeah, part 2, absolutely great part, and next time I'll be covering part 3 whenever I get around to it. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and that's it for today.